I request the owners of Mashal FC, FFC, DB City and Nash FC to take their seats. I request the owners of FFC to please take their seats. I request the owners of Mashal FC, DB City and Nash FC to please take their seats. Kindly take your seats as soon as possible. We are already running late. I request the owners of Mashal FC and DB City to kindly take their seats as soon as possible.
Better keep your hoe in check before you get your hoe checked. Yeah.
Present here this evening. I am Gabrielle Clementine Vegas, and it is my honor to be your host for this evening. A warm welcome to the sixth season of the Bolar Super League Players Auction. After the remarkable success of the past 5 seasons, we are thrilled to embark on another exciting journey. The Bolar Super League has become a symbol of football excellence and community spirit, and we are proud to see its legacy grow year after year. Tonight, as we kick off the auction for Season 6, we celebrate not only the passion for sport, but also the unity and the sportsmanship that this league fosters. Before we begin, it is my honor to introduce Mr. Hanif, the proud owner of Mashal Properties, without whom this event would not be possible. Originally hailing from Kerala, Mr. Hanif has made Mangalore his home, where he has established himself as a visionary in the real estate business. Beyond his professional achievements, Mr. Hanif is well known for his general charitable efforts, always extending a helping hand to the underprivileged and supporting numerous noble causes within our community. A passionate enthusiast of sports, Mr. Hanif has been a steadfast supporter of local talent. As a proud owner of a team in the Bolar Super League, he has played a vital role in nurturing the spirit of competition and camaraderie in sports over the years. His contributions have been instrumental in promoting sports. Kindly put your hands together. We are privileged to have with us the esteemed owners of the 7 incredible teams who bring their vision, dedication, and energy to this league. Let us welcome them. Mr. Nasir Bolar, owner of Nash FC, Mr. Hanif, owner of Mashal FC, Mr. Suhail, owner of DB City FC, Mr. Alam, owner of FFC, Mr. Leswin Morris, owner of CA United, Mr. Glenn Pinto, the owner of Gonzaga FC, and Mr. Javed, the owner of United Jaipur. Along with them, it is my honor to welcome Mr. Aslam, the president of the Dakshina Kannada Football Association, as well as Mr. Hussain, the secretary of the Dakshina Kannada Football Association. Your efforts and enthusiasm are the backbone of this league, and we thank you for being a part of this exciting journey. Every team has a star who embodies their passion, determination, and talent. In the Bolar Super League, we are privileged to have such exceptional players who have served as icons for their respective teams. They are as follows: Mr. Nizam from Nash Bolar, Mr. Adil from FFC, Mr. Aman from Mashal FC, Mr. Chetan from DB City FC, Mr. Unes from United Jaipur, Mr. Junaid from Gonzaga FC, and Mr. Rahul from CA United. Let us once again applaud these incredible players, the icons of the Bolar Super League, who not only inspire their teams but also the entire football community. Thank you. Tonight's auction is where strategies meet opportunities. Teams will compete to build the most formidable squads by securing the best players. Let the bidding reflect the thrill and competition that defines the Bolar Super League. Let us dive into the action and set the stage for an unforgettable Season 6. Best of luck to all the team owners, and may the best bids win. Before we begin the auction, there will be two categories this evening. The A category. Players from the A category will begin their bidding from 1,200 rupees. And the B category. Players from the B category will begin their bidding at 1,000 rupees. The first player from the A category. Number 1, Mr. Mohammad Ansar. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Gonzaga FC at 1,200 rupees. Any bids? Gonzaga FC at 1,200 rupees. Do we see 1,300? Gonzaga FC going once, going twice, sold to Gonzaga. Oh, we have another bid from CA United. 1,300 rupees from CA United. 1,400 rupees from FFC. 1,400 rupees from FFC. Do we see 1,500 from DB City? 1,600 from FFC. Do we see 1,700? 1,700 from Gonzaga FC. 1,800 from DB City. Do we see 1,900, ladies and gentlemen? 1,900. We see 1,900 from FFC. 2,000 rupees from CA United. Do we see 2,100? Do we see 2,100? 2,100 from FFC. Do we see 2,200? 2,200 to DB City. 2,300 from FFC. 2,300. Do we see 2,400? Ladies and gentlemen, do we see 2,400? 2,400 from DB City. Do we see 2,500? Gentlemen, do we see 2,500 this evening? 2,500 from FFC. 2,600. Do we see 2,600, ladies and gentlemen? Do we see 2,600 this evening? 2,600 from DB City. Do we see 2,700? We see 2,700 from FFC. Do we see 2,800, gentlemen? Do we see 2,800 this evening? 2,800, DB City giving competition to FFC. Do we see 2,900? Do we see 2,900 this evening? Yes, FFC with 2,900. Do we see 3,000 rupees? Do we see 3,000 rupees, ladies and gentlemen? Do we see 3,000 rupees this evening? 3,000 rupees from FFC. 3,000 rupees. 3,000 rupees from DB City. Do we see 3,100 rupees? 3,100 rupees from Nash FC. Do we see 3,200 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 3,200 rupees? Do we see 3,200 rupees, gentlemen? Going once. We see 3,200 from FFC. Do we see 3,300? Do we see 3,200? 3,200 from DB City. Do we see 3,300? Gentlemen, do we see 3,300 rupees? Do we see 3,300 rupees? Going once to DB City, and we see 3,300 rupees from Nash FC. Do we see 3,400? Do we see 3,400, gentlemen? Do we see 3,400? 3,400. Okay, 3,300 going once to Nash FC. Going twice. Sold to Nash FC. We would now like to welcome the Secretary of the Dakshina Kannada Football Association, Mr. Hussain. We would like Mr. Ashfaq to present him with a token of gratitude. From the B category, we have number 98, Mr. Afraz. Bidding starts at 1,000 rupees. Number 98, Mr. Afraz. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000 rupees, gentlemen? 1,000 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1,100 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 1,100 rupees, gentlemen? Going once. We see 1,100 rupees from FFC. Do we see 1,200 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 1,200 rupees, gentlemen? Going once for 1,100 rupees to FFC. Going once. Going twice. We see 1,200 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1,300 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 1,300 rupees? 1,300 rupees from FFC. Do we see 1,400 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 1,400 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 1,400 rupees? Going once to FFC at 1,300 rupees. Going once. 1,400 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1,500, gentlemen? Do we see 1,500, gentlemen? Going once at 1,400 to Gonzaga. We see 1,500 rupees from FFC. Do we see 1.6? Do we see 1.6, gentlemen? 1.6. Do we see 1.6? Do we see 1,600 rupees? Going once at 1,500 rupees to FFC. Going once. Going twice. And we see 1,600 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1,700 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 1.7, gentlemen? Going once at we see 1.7 from FFC. Bidding war continues. Do we see 1.8, gentlemen? Do we see 1.8? Do we see 1,800 rupees, gentlemen? Going once at 1.7 to FFC. Going twice. We see 1.8 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1.9, gentlemen? Do we see 1,900 rupees this evening? Do we see 1.9, gentlemen? We see 1.9 from FFC. Do we see 1.10? Sorry, 2,000. Do we see 2,000 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 2,000 rupees? Going once at 1.9 to FFC. Going once at 1 point. We see 2,000 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 2.1? Do we see 2,100 rupees, gentlemen? 2,100 from FFC. Do you want to contradict that with 2,200? Gonzaga FC. Okay then, going once. 2,100. FFC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 2,100 to FFC. Our next player from the B category, number 68, Mr. Shamir. Number 68 player from the B category, Mr. Shamir. Bidding starts at 1,000 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see any bidding at 1,000 rupees? Okay. Going once. And we see a bid at 1,000 rupees from United Jaipur. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1 this evening, gentlemen? Okay. Going once at 1,000 rupees to United Jaipur. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 rupees to United Jaipur.
Yeah, we have one more guest. If you have to tell Nasir Pandeshwar, we welcome Nasir Pandeshwar. Who is giving gift? Falta.
We would like to welcome Mr. Nasir Pandeshwar this evening. I request a memento to be presented to him. I request Mr. Altaf to present a memento to Mr. Nasir. The bidding continues with the player from the B category, number 30, Mr. Rilwan. Number 30, Mr. Rilwan. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? We see a bid for 1,000 rupees from DB City. Do we see 1.1, gentlemen? Do we see 1.1? We see 1.1 from FFC and 1.2 from Mashal. 1.2 from Mashal. Do we see 1.3? We see 1.3 from DB City. Do we see 1.4, gentlemen? Do we see 1.4? 1,400 rupees. We see 1,400 rupees from FFC. Do we see 1.5 from DB City? Do we see 1.6? Do we see 1.6? 1,600 rupees, gentlemen. Do we see 1,600 rupees? 1,600 rupees from FFC. 1,700 rupees from Mashal FC. 1,800 rupees from DB City. Do we see 1.9, gentlemen? 1.9 from FFC. 2,000 rupees from DB City. Do we see 2,100, gentlemen? Do we see 2,100? Going once at 2,000 rupees to DB City. Going once at 2,000. We see FFC at 2,200 rupees. FFC at 2,200. Do we see 2,300, gentlemen? Do we see 2,300? Going once at 2,000. We see 2,300 from Nash FC, 2,400 from DB City. Do we see 2.5, gentlemen? Do we see 2.5 this evening? Going once at 2.4 to DB City. Going once at 2.4 to DB City. We see 2.5 from Nash FC. Do we see 2.6? Do we see 2,600 rupees, gentlemen? 2.6. Do we see 2.6? Going once at 2.5. We see 2.6 from DB City. Do we see 2.7, gentlemen? Do we see 2.7 this evening? We see 2.7 from Nash FC. Do we see 2.8? DB City, do we see 2.8? Going once at 2.7 to Nash FC. We see 2.8 from DB City. Do we see 2.9? Yes, we see 2.9 from Nash FC. 2,000 rupees. Do we see 2,000 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 2,000 rupees from DB City? We see 3,000 rupees. Oh, 3,000. Do we see 3,000 rupees? Okay, then sold at 2.9 to Nash FC. We have a player from the A category, number 89, Mr. Victor. Bidding starts at 1,200 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees and Gonzaga FC at 1,200 rupees. Do we see 1.3?
Represented Nigeria in the 2010 World Cup. This guy. Not one more. Valentin. That guy was a 2010. Yeah, one. The Valentin about Nigeria.
Gentlemen, we have Mr. Victor, who is a Nigerian player. The bidding for him will begin at 2,000 rupees. Do we see a bid for 2,000 rupees for Mr. Victor? We see 2,000 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 2.1? Do we see 2.1, gentlemen? We see 2.1 from Mashal FC. Do we see 2.2? 2.2 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 2.3 from FFC? 2.4. We see 2.4 from Mashal FC, 2.5 from Gonzaga FC, 2.6 from FFC. Do we see 2.7 from Gonzaga FC? Do we see 2.8? Do we see 2.8, gentlemen? Do we see 2.8? Going once at 2.7? We see 2.8 from Mashal FC. Do we see 2.9 from Gonzaga FC? Do we see 3,000 rupees from FFC? Do we see 3.1? Do we see 3.1, gentlemen? Going once at 3,000 rupees, 3.1 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 3.2? Do we see 3.2, gentlemen? Going once at 3.1, we see 3.2 from Mashal FC. Do we see 3.3? 3.3 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 3.4, gentlemen? Do we see 3.4? Going once at 3.3 to Gonzaga FC. Going once, we see 3.4 from Mashal FC. Do we see 3.5, gentlemen? Do we see 3.5? Going once at 3.4, we see 3.5 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 3.6, gentlemen? Do we see 3.6? Going once at 3.5 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.6 from Mashal FC. Do we see 3.7? Do we see 3.7, gentlemen? Going once at 3.6 to Mashal FC. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.7 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 3.8? We see 3.8 from Mashal FC. Do we see 3.9? 3.9 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 4,000 rupees? Do we see 4,000 rupees, gentlemen? Going once at 3.9 to Gonzaga. Going once. We see 4,000 rupees from Mashal FC. Do we see 4,100? Do we see 4.1? Do we see 4.1, gentlemen? Going once at, we see 4.1 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 4.2? Do we see 4.2? Going once at 4.1 to Gonzaga, going once. Going twice, we see 4.2 from Mashal FC. Do we see 4.3? 4.3, gentlemen. Do we see 4.3? Going once at 4.2 to Mashal FC, going once. Going twice. We see 4.3 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 4.4? Gentlemen, do we see 4.4? Going once at 4.3 to Gonzaga, going once. We see 4.4 from Mashal FC. Do we see 4.5, gentlemen? Do we see 4.5 thousand rupees, gentlemen? 4,500 rupees, gentlemen. Do we see 4,500? Going once at 4.4 to Mashal FC, going once. Going twice. Sold to Mashal FC. Our next players from the B category, at number 2 we have Mr. Glenn Martha. Mr. Glenn Martha, the bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Do we see any bids? Okay then, going once. Going twice. We see one bid from CA United. 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1, gentlemen? Ladies and gentlemen, do we see 1.1? Okay then, going once at 1,000 rupees. We see 1.1 from DB City. Do we see 1.2? Do we see 1.2? Going once at 1.1 to DB City. Going once. Going twice. Sold to DB City. Our next player from the B category, number 48, Mr. Ilwan. Number 48, Mr. Ilwan. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Do we see any bids? We are not seeing any bids, so going once. Going once. Going twice. Unsold. Moving on to the next player. Check. The next player from the B category, number 74, Mr. Arman. Number 74, Mr. Arman. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, ladies and gentlemen? Do we see any bids? Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1? Okay then, going once to Gonzaga FC. Going once at 1,000 to Gonzaga FC. Going twice. Sold to Gonzaga FC. The next player from the B category, number 9, Mr. Azmal. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Number 9, Mr. Azmal. Do we see any bids at 1,000 rupees? Do we see any bids at 1,000 rupees, gentlemen? Going once. We see one bid from City Arena. Okay, we see 1.1 from FFC. Do we see 1.2? Do we see 1.2? Do we see 1.2? Going once at 1.1 to FFC, going once. We see 1.2 from CA United. Do we see 1.3? Do we see 1.3, gentlemen? Going, we see 1.3 from FFC. Do we see 1.4? Ladies and gentlemen, do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3 to FFC, going once, going twice. We see 1.4 from CA United. Do we see 1.5? Do we see 1.5? Going once at 1.4, going once, going twice. Sold to CA United. The next player from the A category, number 34, Mr. Farhan. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees, gentlemen. We see Gonzaga FC with 1,200 and we see Jaipur United with 1,300, 1,400 from Gonzaga, 1,500 from Nash FC, 1,600 from Gonzaga, 1,700 from Nash. Do we see 1.8 from Gonzaga? 1.9 from Nash FC, 2,000 rupees from Gonzaga, 2.1 from Nash FC, 2.2 from Gonzaga, 2.3 from Jaipur United. Do you see 2.4? Going once at 2.3 to Jaipur United. Going once, we see 2.4 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.5? Do we see 2.5, gentlemen? We see 2.5 from Nash FC. Do we see 2.6 from Gonzaga FC? 2.7. Do we see 2.7? Going once at 2.6 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. We see 2.7 from Mashal FC. 2.8 from Nash FC. Do we see 2.9? 2.9 from Jaipur United. Do we see 3,000 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see 3,000 rupees, gentlemen? 3,000 rupees, gentlemen. Do we see 3,000 rupees, gentlemen? 3,000 rupees from Nash FC. Do we see 3.1? Do we see 3.1? Going once at 3,000 rupees. 3.1 from DB City. Do we see 3.2? Do we see 3.2, gentlemen? 3.2 from Jaipur United. Do we see 3.3? 3.3 from Nash FC. Do we see 3.4? 3.4 from DB City. Do we see 3.5? 3.5 from Nash FC. Do we see 3.6? Do we see 3.6, gentlemen? Going once at 3.5 to Nash FC. Going once. We see 3.6 from DB City. Do we see 3.7? Do we see 3.7, gentlemen? Going once at 3.6 to DB City. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.7 from Gonzaga and 3.8 from FFC. Do we see 3.9? Do we see 3.9 from DB City? Do we see 4,000? 4,000 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 4.1? Do we see 4.1, gentlemen? Do we see 4.1? Going once at 4,000. We see 4.1 from FFC. Do we see 4.2? 4.2 from DB City. Do we see 4.3? Do we see 4.3, gentlemen? 4.3 from Nash FC. Do we see 4.4? Do we see 4.4? Going once at 4.3 to Nash FC. Going once. 4.4 from DB City. 4.5 from FFC. Do we see 4.6? 4,600 from Nash FC. Do we see 4,700? 4.7. Do we see 4.7, gentlemen? Going once at 4.6 to Nash FC. Going 4.7 from DB City. Do we see 4.8? Do we see 4.8, gentlemen? Do we see going once at 4.7 to DB City? 4.8 from FFC. Do we see 4.9? Do we see 4.9? Going once at 4.8 to FF. 4.9 from DB City. Do we see 5,000, gentlemen? Do we see 5,000? Do we see 5,000? FFC, do we see 5,000? Do we see 5,000? 5,000 from FFC. Do we see 5.1? 5.1 from DB City. Do we see 5.2? Gentlemen. Do we see 5.2? Do we see 5.2? FFC, do we see 5.2? 5.2 from FFC, everybody. Do we see 5.3? Do we see 5.3? We see 5.3 from DB City. Do we see 5.4? Do we see 5.4? 5.4 from FFC. Do we see 5.5? DB City, do we see 5.5? 5.5 from DB City. Do we see 5.6? 5.6. Do we see 5.6? 5.6 from FFC. Do we see 5.7? Gentlemen, do we see 5.7? 5.7 from DB City. Do we see 5.8? 5.8. FFC, do we see 5.8? 5.8 from FFC. Do we see 5.9? 5.9. Do we see 5.9? DB City. Going once at 5.8 to FFC. Okay then. Go 5.8 from DB City. Do we see 5.9? FFC, do we see 5.9? 5.9. Going once at 5.8 to DB City. $5.9 from FFC. The bidding war gets intense. Do we see 6,000 rupees? 6,000 rupees. Do we see 6,000? DB City, do we see 6,000? ₹6,000 from DB City. Do we see 6.1? FFC, do we see 6.1? We have ₹6,000 from DB City, and do we see 6.1? Going once at 6,000 to DB City. Going once, going twice, sold to DB City. I would like to take a minute to welcome Mr. Aslam, the President of the Dakshina Kannada Football Association. Let us put our hands together for him. I would request Mr. Ashil to present him with a token of gratitude.
Give them time. One.
From the B category, we have player number 73, Mr. Hakim. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Mr. Hakim, bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids at 1,000 rupees? At 1,000 rupees, do we see any bids? Seeing no bids, going once. We see one bid from FFC, 1.1 from Nash FC, 1.2. Do we see 1.2? Going once at 1.1 from Nash FC, going once. Going 1.2 to FFC. Do we see 1.3? 1.3 from Nash FC. Do we see 1.4? 1.4 from DB City. Do we see 1.5, gentlemen? 1.5 from FFC. 1.6 from Nash FC. Do we see 1.7 from FFC? Do we see 1.8? Going once at 1.7 to 1.8 from Nash FC. Do we see 1.9 from FFC? 2,000 rupees. Do we see 2,000 rupees, gentlemen? 2,000 rupees. Going once at 1.9 to FFC. Going once at 1.9 to FFC. Going twice. We see 2,000 rupees to Nash FC. 2.1 from FFC. Do we see 2.2? Do we see 2.2? 2.2 from Nash FC. 2.3 from FFC. 2.4 from Nash FC. 2.5 from FFC. 2.6 from Nash. 2.7 from FFC. Nash FC, do we see 2.8? Going once at 2.7. Going twice at 2.7. We see 2.8 from Jaipur United. Do we see 2.9 from FFC? 3,000 rupees. Do we see 3,000 rupees? Going once at 2.9. 3,000 rupees from Jaipur United. Do we 3,100 from FFC? Do we see 3,200? Going once at 3,200 from Jaipur United. Do we see 3.3? 3.3 from FFC. 3.4 from Jaipur United. 3.5 from FFC. 3.6 from Jaipur United. 3.7 from FFC. 3.8 from Jaipur United. 3.9 from FFC. 4,000 rupees from Jaipur United. 4.1 from FFC. 4.2 from Jaipur United. The bidding war builds. Do we see 4.3, gentlemen? FFC, do we see 4.3? Going 4.3 from FFC. Do we see 4.4? Jaipur United, do we see 4.4? Going once at 4.3 to FFC. Going once, 4.4 from Jaipur United. Do we see 4.5? Going once at 4.4 to Jaipur United. Going once, going twice. Sold at 4,400 rupees to Jaipur United. I request the placards to be raised properly so that they can be noticed. The next player is going to be from the B category. Player number 46, Mr. Lohit. Player number 46, Mr. Lohit. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. 1,000 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Starting off strong. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Go. And we see 1.1 from Mashal FC. Do we see 1.2? 1.2 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.3? Do we see 1.3 from Mashal FC? 1.4. Do we see 1.4, gentlemen? Gonzaga FC, do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3 to Mashal FC. Going once. 1.4 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1.5? 1.5, gentlemen. Do we see 1.5? Going once at 1.4 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. We see 1.5 from Mashal FC. Do we see 1.6? Going once at 1.5 to Mashal FC. Going twice. Sold at 1.5 to Mashal FC. From the B category, we have player number 72, Mr. Ashveed. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. We see one bid at 1,000 rupees from Jaipur United. Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees to Jaipur United. Going once. We see 1.1 from FFC. Do we see 1.2? 1.2. Do we see 1.2? Going once at 1.1 to FFC. Going twice. We see 1.2 from Jaipur United. Do we see 1.3? 1.3 from DB City. Do we see 1.4? 1.4 from FFC. 1.5. Do we see 1.5 from Jaipur United? 1.6. 1.6 from FFC. 1.7. Do we see 1.7? 1.7 from Jaipur. 1.8 from FFC. 1.9 from Jaipur. 2,000 from FFC. Going once at 2,000. Going to, we see 2.1 from Jaipur United. Do we see 2.2? Do we see 2.2? Going once at 2.1 to Jaipur United. Going once. We see 2.2 from FFC. Do we see 2.3? Do we see 2.3? Going once at 2.2 to FFC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 2,200 rupees to FFC. The next player is from the A category. Player number 20, Mr. Adil Shah. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids from Gonzaga FC? We begin 1,200, 1,300 from Jaipur. Do we see 1.4? Do we see 1.4, gentlemen? Going once at 1.32. Going once at 1.3 to Jaipur United. Going once. We see 1.4 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1.5? Do we see 1.5? Going once at 1,400 rupees to Gonzaga. Going twice. We see 1.5 from FFC. Do we see 1.6 from Gonzaga? Do we see 1.7? Going once at 1,600 rupees to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. We see 1,700 rupees from FFC. Do we see 1,800? 1,800 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1,900? Do we see 1,900? 1,900 from FFC. Do we see 2,000? 2,000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2,100? Do we see 2.1? Going once at 2,000 rupees. Going twice at 2,000 rupees. We see 2,100 rupees from FFC. 2,200 rupees. 2,300 rupees from Jaipur United. Do we see 2.4 from Gonzaga? 2.5. Do we see 2.5? Going once at 2.4 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 2.5 from FFC. 2.6 from Jaipur. Do we see 2.7? 2.7 from Gonzaga. 2.8 from FFC. Do we see 2.9? 2.9 from Gonzaga. 3,000 rupees from FFC. Going once at 3,000. Going twice at 3,000. Going once at 3,000 to FFC. Going twice. We see 3,100 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 3,200? 3.2, gentlemen. Do we see 3.2? Going once at 3.1 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going. We see 3,200 from FFC. Do we see 3,300? 3.3, gentlemen. Do we see 3.3? Do we see 3.3? Gonzaga FC. Do we see 3.3? Going once at 3,200 to FFC. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.3 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 3,400? 3,400 from FFC. Do we 3.5? Do we see 3.5? Do we see 3.5? Going once at 3.4 to FFC. Going once. Going twice. Sold to FFC. .4. 4. 4. Sold at 3.4 to FFC. The next player from the B category, player number 19, Mr. Shadin. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see bids? Do we see any bids? Going once. We see one bid at 1,000 rupees from Jaipur United. Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees. Going once, going twice. Sold at 1,000 rupees to Jaipur United. The next number 18, player number 18, Mr. Taisir. From the B category, bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Seeing no bids, going once. Going once, going twice. Unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 61, Mr. Shaheem. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Going once. Going twice. Seeing no bids, player remains unsold. I can't find it, man. He's only. These are all sold. The next player from the B category, player number 32, Mr. Hitesh. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Seeing no bids, we go once. Going once. Going twice. Unsold. The next player is from the A category, player number 85, Mr. Adil. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Do we see any bids? Do we see 1,200? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 15, Mr. Paju. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? We see 1,000 rupees from CA United. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees to CA United. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 rupees to CA United. Player number 47 from the B category, Mr. Nathan. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. We see 1,000 rupees from 1,100 from Mashal. 1,200 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.3? Do we see 1.3? 1.3 from DB City. Do we see 1.4 from Gonzaga FC? 1.5. Do we see 1.5? Going once at 1.4 to DB City. Going once. We see 1.5 from Gonzaga. 1.6. 1.6. Do we see 1.6? 1.6 from DB City. Do we see 1.7 from Gonzaga? Do we see 1.8? Going once at 1.7 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 1.8 from CA United. 1.9 from Gonzaga. 2,000 from CA United. 2.1 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.2 CA United? 2.2 from CA United. 2.3 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.4? C United, do we see 2.4? 2.4 from Mashala FC, do we see 2.5? 2.5 from C United, do we see 2.6 from Gonzaga? Do we see 2.7? Gentlemen, do we see 2.7? 2.7 from C United, do we see 2.8? 2.8, going once at 2.7 to 2.8 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.9? Do we see 2.9? Going once at 2.8, 2.9 from C United. Do we see 3,000? 3,000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 3.1? Going once at 3,000 rupees to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.1 from C United. Do we see 3.2? Do we see 3.2? Going once at 3.1 to C United. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 3.1 to C United. $3.2. 77. Next player from 77. B category. Mr. Nizam. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000 rupees? Do we see 1,000 rupees? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going. We see 1,000 rupees from Mashal FC. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees to Mashal FC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 rupees to Mashal FC. ₹1,000. The next player from the B category, player number 17, Mr. Isham. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000 rupees? Do we see 1,000 rupees? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. We will now take a short 5-minute break for refreshments. We will see you in 5 minutes to continue the auction. I request all the team owners to return back to their seats immediately. We are running short on time. I would like to continue with the auction. I request all the team owners to return back to their seats immediately. We are running short on time and would like to continue with the auction. The team owners of United Jaipur, we request the team owners of United Jaipur to return to their seats immediately. Okay, then we will be continuing on with the auction now. The next player is from the A category. Player number 6, Mr. Suhaid. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees for Mr. Suhaid. We see 1,200 from CA United. Do we see 1.3? 1.3 from Nash FC. 1.4. Do we see 1.4? Do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3 to Nash FC. Going once. Going. We see 1.4 from DB City. 1.5 from FFC. Do we see 1.6? 1.6 from Nash FC. Going once at 1.6 to Nash FC. Going one. We see 1.7 from DB City. Do we see 1.8? 1.8 from Nash FC. Going once at 1.8 to Nash FC. Going once. Going twice. We see 1.9 from FFC. Do we see 2,000 rupees? Do we see 2,000 rupees from Nash FC? Going once. Going twice. 2.1 from FFC. 2.3 from DB City. Do we see 2.4? 2.4 from Nash FC. 2.5 from FFC. Do we see 2.6? Going once at 2.6 from Nash FC. Do we see 2.7? Going once at 2.6 to Nash FC. Going once. Going twice. 2.7 from FFC. 2.8 from Nash FC. 2.9 from FFC. Do we see 3,000? 3,000 from Nash FC. Going once at 3,000 to Nash FC. Going once. 3.1 from FFC. Do we see 3.2? 3.2 from Nash FC. 3.3 from FFC. 3.4. Do we see 3.4? Going once at 3.3 to FFC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 3,300 rupees to FFC. The next player from the B category, player number 33, Mr. Solomon. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. We have 1,000 rupees from Mashal FC. We have 1.1 from Gonzaga FC. Do we have 1.2? 1.1 going at 1.1 once to Gonzaga FC. 1,100 going once. Going twice. We see 1.2 from FFC. Do we see 1.3? Going once at 1. We see 1.3 from Mashal FC. Do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3 to Mashal FC. Going once. We see 1.4 from FFC. Do we see 1.5? Going once at 1.4 to FFC. Going once. Going twice. We see 1.4 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.5? 1.5 from FFC. Do we see 1.6? Going once at 1.5. Going once. Going twice. 1.6 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1.7? 1.7 from FFC. Do we see 1.8? 1.8 from Gonzaga. 1.9 from FFC. 2,000 rupees from Gonzaga. 2.1 from FFC. 2.2 from Gonzaga. 2.3 from FFC. Going one. 2.4 from Gonzaga. Going once at 2.4. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 2,400 rupees to Gonzaga FC. The next player from the B category, player number 11, Mr. Varun Gowda. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Seeing no bids, going once. Going once. Okay, we see one bid from Mashal FC begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1 from DB City? Do we see 1.2? 1.2. Going once at 1.1 to DB City, going once. 1.2 from Mashal FC. Do we see 1.3? Going once at 1.2 to Mashal FC, going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,200 rupees to Mashal FC. The next player from the A category, Mr. Bashar, player number 97. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids at 1.2? 1.2. Seeing no bids, going once. Seeing no bids, going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 53. Player number 53, Mr. Akif. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? We see 1,000 rupees from Nash FC. Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 rupees to Nash FC. The next player from the B category, player number 80, Mr. Mehroof. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Player number 80, Mr. Mehroof. Do we see any bids at 1,000 rupees, gentlemen? Do we see any bids? We see 1,000 rupees from City Arena. CA United. Do we see 1.1? Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees to CA United. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 rupees to CA United. What the hell? The next player from the B category, player number 24, Mr. Shaz. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going, okay, we see 1,000 rupees from Nash. We see 1.1 from FFC. Okay, gentlemen, there's been a small mistake. This player is from the A category. The bidding will begin at 1,200 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,200. Do we see any bids? We see 1,200 from Nash, 1,300 from FFC. Do we see 1.4 from Nash? Do we see 1.5 from FFC? 1.6 from Nash. 1.7. Do we see 1.7 FFC? FFC, do we see 1.7? Okay. Going once at 1.6 to Nash FC. Going once. 1.7 from FFC. 1.8 to Nash FC. Do we see 1.9? Do we see 1.9? Going once at 1.8 to Nash FC. Going once. Going, okay, we see 1.9 from FFC. Do we see 2,000 rupees? 2,000 rupees from Nash FC. Do we see 2.1? Going once at 2,000 rupees. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 2,000 rupees to Nash FC. The next player is from the B category, player number 38, Mr. Jafar. Player number 38, Mr. Jafar. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 84, Mr. Mushtaq. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. We see 1,000 rupees from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.1? 1.1 from FFC. 1.2. Do we see 1.2? Do we see 1.2? Going once at 1.1 to FFC. 1.2 from DB City. Do we see 1.3? 1.3 from FFC. Do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3 to FFC. Going once. Going twice. 1.4 from DB City. 1.5 from Ashal. Do we see 1.6? Do we see 1.6? 1.6 from FFC. Do we see 1.7? Going once at 1.6. Going twice. We see 1.7 from DB City. Do we see 1.8? Going once at 1.7. 1.8 from FFC. Do we see 1.9? Do we see 1.9? Going once at 1.8. Going twice at 1.8 to FFC. Sold at 1,800 rupees to FFC. The next player from the A category, bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Player number 96, Mr. Imran. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. We see one bid at 1,200 rupees from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 1.3? 1.3 from Nash. 1.4. Do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3 to Nash FC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,300 rupees to Nash FC. The next player from the B category, player number 101, Mr. Shafiq. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Going once. Going once. The next player, player number 101, Mr. Shafiq. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 35, Mr. Anik. Mr. Anik, do we see any bids? Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids, going once. Going twice. Seeing no bids, going once, going twice, player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 41, Mr. Musa. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids at 1,000 rupees? Do we see any bids? Do we see 1,000? Seeing no bids, going once, going twice, player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 50, Mr. Sahil. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000? Do we see 1,000? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player is from the A category. Player number 90, Mr. Nazar. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. 90. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? We see 1,200 from Gonzaga FC. 1,300 from CA. 1,400 from DB City. 1,400. Do we see 1,500? Going once at 1,400. Going twice. We see 1,500, 1,600 from Mashal, 1,700 from FFC. Do we see 1.8? 1.8 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.9? 1.9 from FFC. Do we see 2,000? 2,000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.1? 2.1 from DB City. 2.2 from FFC. 2.3 from Gonzaga. 2.4 from FFC. 2.5. Do we see 2.5? Going once at 2.4 to FFC. Going once. Going twice. We see 2.5 from DB City. 2.6 from Mashal FC. 2.7 from Gonzaga. 2.8 from FFC. Do we see 2.9? Going once at 2.8 to FFC. Going once. Going. We see 2.9 from Gonzaga. We see 3,000 from DB City. Do we see 3.1? 3.1. 3.1 from Gonzaga FC. 3.2 from DB City. 3.3. 3.3 from Gonzaga. Do we see 3.4? Going once at 3.3 to 3.4 from DB City. Do we see 3.5 from Gonzaga? 3.6. Going once at 3.5. Going once. Going twice. 3.6 from DB City. 3.7 from Mashal. 3.8 from Nash FC. Do we see 3.9 from Gonzaga? 4,000. Going once at 3.9 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 4,000 from DB City. 4.1 from Mashal. Do we see 4.2? 4.2 from Gonzaga. Do we see 4.3? Going once at 4.2 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 4.3 from Mashal. 4.4 from DB City. 4.5 from Gonzaga. Do we see 4.6? Do we see 4.6 from Mashal? 4.7. Going once at 4.6 to Mashal. 4.7 from Gonzaga. Do we see 4.8? Going once at 4.7 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. 4.8 from DB City. Do we see 4.9? 4.9 from Gonzaga. Do we see 5,000? Going once at 4.9. Going once. 5,000 from Mashal FC. Do we see 5.1? Going once at 5,000 to Mashal FC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 5,000 rupees to Mashal FC. The next players from the A category. Player number 39, Mr. Fayaz. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids? 1,200. Do we see 1,200? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 43, Mr. Rilwan. Player number 43, Mr. Rilwan. Player number 43, Mr. Rilwan. Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player, player number 62 from the B category, Mr. Faraz. Mr. Faraz. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000? Do we see a bid? Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player from the B category, player number 4, Mr. Hashir. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. We see 1,000 from Gonzaga. 1.1. Going once at 1000. Going twice at 1000. 1.1 from FFC, 1.2 from Jaipur United, 1.3 from FFC, 1.4 from Nash, 1.5 from FFC, 1.6. Do we see 1.6? Going once at 1.5 to FFC. Going once. Going. Okay, we see 1.6 from Jaipur United. Do we see 1.7? Going once at 1.6 to Jaipur United. Going once. Going twice. We see 1.7 from Gonzaga. 1.8 from DB City. Do we see 1.9? 1.9 from FFC. 2000 from Jaipur United. 2.1. Do we see 2.1? Going once at 2000 to Jaipur United. Going once. Going twice. We see 2.1 from Gonzaga. 2.2 from DB City. Do we see 2.3? Going 2.3 from Jaipur United. Do we see 2.4? Going once at 2.3. Going once. Going twice. Sold for 2000. We see 2.4 from DB City. 2.3. Okay. 2.3. We see 2.4 from DB City. We see 2.4. Kindly raise your placards. 2.4. We see 2.4. 2.5 from Jaipur United. 2.6 from DB City. 2.7 from Jaipur United. 2.8 from DB City. 2.9 from Jaipur United. 3,000 rupees from DB City. Going once at 3,000 to DB City. Going once. 3.1 from Jaipur United. Do we see 3.2? Going once at 3.1 to Jaipur United. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.2 from DB City. Do we see 3.3? Going once at 3.2 to DB City. Going once. We see 3.3 from Jaipur United. Going once at 3,300 rupees to Jaipur United. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.4 from DB City. Do we see 3.5? 3,400 from DB City. Do we see 3.5? Going once at 3,400 rupees to DB City. Going once. Going. We see 3,500 rupees from Jaipur United. Do we see 3.6? 3.6. Do we see 3.6? Going once at 3,500 rupees to Jaipur United. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.6 from DB City. Do we see 3.7? Do we see 3.7? Going once at 3.6. Going once. Going twice. We see 3.7 from Jaipur United. Do we see 3.8? Going once at 3.7 to Jaipur United. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 3,700 rupees to Jaipur United.
You have to read this, okay? Marshall remaining, they need 3 players. From this amount is remaining balance. This one Nash, Marshall.
They need 3.
Yeah.
Okay. They have not. They have bought the rest. They need remaining.
Remaining 3 with this amount.
Okay, fine.
Just to cross check them, tell them. Once we begin, we'll have to.
Before we begin again, water korla na.
Got it, no? Once you just check the tell them.
Hello. Come here, come here. Sir. For a raffle, I will now be reading out the details. Kindly cross-check before we begin again. Nash FC still has 3 more players to buy within the amount of 12,300 rupees. Mashal FC has 3 more players to buy within the amount of 9,900 rupees. Jaipur United has a number of 4 players to buy within the amount of 12,900 rupees. C United has to buy 4 players within the amount of 16,500 rupees. FFC has 3 players to buy with 10,200 rupees. DB City has 6 players to buy within the amount of 15,800 rupees. Gonzaga FC has 6 players to buy within the amount of 19,600 rupees. Not with me, with them.
Okay, that is okay. So just cross it. Tell that Nash is 12,500.
Yeah,
Is it written?
Nash 12,500.
12,500. Yeah, fine, fine.
12,500. 12,500, I mentioned.
Okay, that's fine.
Next. Wait, man. Uh-huh. Okay, continuing on with the auction, the next player we have is okay, continuing on with the auction, we have the next player, player number 88, Mr. Valentine. He is a Nigerian player who represented the country in the 2010 World Cup. Bidding for this player begins at 2,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? 2,000 rupees, gentlemen. Do we see any bids? We see 2,000 from CA United. 2,000 from CA United. Going once. Going 2,100, 2,200 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2,300? 2,300 from Mashal. 2,400 from CA. 2,500 from Mashal. 2,600. Do we see 2,600? Going once at 2,500. Going twice at 2,500. 2,600 from CA. 2,700 from Mashal. 2,800 from CA. 2,900 from FFC. Do we see 3,000? 3,000 from CA. 3.1 from Gonzaga. 3.2 from Jaipur United. Do we see 3.3? 3.3 from FFC. Do we see 3.4? Going once at 3.3 to FFC. Going once. 3.4 from Mashal. 3.5 from DB City. Do we see 3.6? Do we see 3.6? 3.6 from Mashal. Do we see 3.7? Going once at 3.6 to Mashal. Going once. Going twice. 3.7 from DB City. 3.8 from CA. 3.9 from Gonzaga. 4,000 from DB City. 4.1 from Gonzaga. Do we see 4.2? Going once at 4.1 to Gonzaga. 4.2 from Mashal. 4.3 from Gonzaga. Do we see 4.4? Do we see 4.4? Going once at 4.3, 4.4 from Mashal. 4.5 from Gonzaga, 4.6 from DB City. Going once at 4.6 to DB City, 4.7 from Gonzaga. Going once at 4.7 to Gonzaga. Going once, going twice, 4.8 from Mashal, 4.9 from DB City. Do we see 5? 5 from Gonzaga. Going once at 5,000 to Gonzaga. Going once, going twice, 5.1 from DB City. 5.2 from Gonzaga. 5.3 from Mashal. Do we see 5.4? Going once at 5.4 from DB City. Do we see 5.5? Gonzaga FC, do we see 5.5? 5.5 from Mashal FC. 5.6 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 5.7? Do we see 5.7 from DB City? Do we see 5.8? Going once at 5.7 to DB City. Going once. We see 5.8 from Gonzaga. 5.9. Do we see 5.9? 5.9 from Mashal. 6,000 from DB City. 6.1 from Gonzaga. 6.2. Do we see 6.2? Going once at 6.1 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 6.2 from Mashal. 6.3 from DB City. Do we see 6.4 from Gonzaga? Do we see 6.5? 6.4 from Gonzaga. Going once. We see 6.5 from DB City. 6.6 from Mashal FC. 6.7 from Gonzaga FC. 6.8. Do we see 6.8? Going once at 6.7 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. 6.8 from DB. 6.9 from Mashal. 7,000. 7,000 from Gonzaga FC. Do we see 7.1? Going once at 7,000 rupees to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. 7.1 from Mashal. 7.2 from DB City. Do we see 7.3? Do we see 7.3? 7.3 from Mashal. Do we see 7.4? Going once at 7.3. Going twice. 7.4 from Gonzaga. Do we see 7.5 from Mashal? Do we see 7.6? Going once at 7.5. Going once. Going 7.6 from Gonzaga. Do we see 7.7? Going once at 7.6 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 7.7 from Mashal. Do we see 7.8? Going once at 7.7. Going once. 7.8 from Gonzaga. Do we see 7.9? 7.9 from Mashal. Do we see 8,000? Do we see 8,000 from Gonzaga? 8,000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 8.1? Do we see 8.1? Going once at 8,000 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. So, okay, we see 8.1 from DB City. We see 8.1 from DB City. Do we see 8.2? Do we see 8.2? Do we see 8.2? Going once at 8.1 to DB City. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 8.1 thousand rupees to DB City. 8.1. 8.1. DB City. The next player from the A category, Mr. Fahiz. Player number 5, Mr. Fahiz from the A category. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Gonzaga FC with 1,300 from United Jaipur. Do we see 1.4? 1.4 from Gonzaga, 1.5 from Nash, 1.6. Do we see 1.6? Going once at 1.5 to Nash, 1.6 from Gonzaga, 1.7 from Nash. Do we see 1.8? 1.8 from Mashal. Do we see 1.9 from Gonzaga? 2,000 from Nash, 2.1. Do we see 2.1? 2.1 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.2? 2.2 from Nash. Do we see 2.3? Going once at 2.3 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.4 from Nash? 2.5. Do we see 2.5? Going once at 2.5 from Gonzaga. 2.6 from Mashal. Do we see 2.7? 2.7 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.8? 2.8 from FFC. Do we see 2.9? Do we see 2.9? 2.9 from Nash. 3,000 from FFC. 3.1 from Gonzaga. 3.2 from FFC. Do we see 3.3 from Nash? 3.4 from FFC. 3.5 from Nash. 3.6 from FFC. Do we see 3.7? 3.7 from Nash. 3.8 from FFC. Do we see 3.9 from Nash? 4,000 from FFC. Do we see 4.1?
DBC 3,800 balance.
4.1 from Nash. Do we see 4.2? Do we see 4.2? 4.1 from 4.2 from FFC. 4.3 from Nash. Do we see 4.4? FFC, do we see 4.4? Do we see 4.4? 4.4 from FFC. 4.5 from Nash. 4.6. 4.7. 4.8 from FFC. 4.9 from Nash. 5,000 from FFC. 5.1 from Nash. 5.2 from FFC. 5.3. Do we see 5.4? 5.4 from FFC. 5.5. 5.6. 5.7. 5.7 from Nash. 5.8 from FFC. 5.9 from Nash. 6,000 from FFC. 6.1 from Nash. 6.2. Do we see 6.2? Going once at 6.1 to Nash. Going once. Going twice. FFC. Do we see 6.3? Do we see 6.4? Nash FC. 6.4. 6.5 from FFC. 6.6 from Nash. FFC. Do we see 6.7? Going once at 6.6 to Nash FC. Going once. Going twice. 6.8 from FFC. Do we see 6.9? 6.9 from Nash. 7,000. Do we see 7,000 from... Okay then. Going once at 6.9 to Nash FC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 6,900 rupees to Nash FC. The next player is from the A category, player number 22 from the A category, Mr. Anvir. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any? 1,200 from Gonzaga. 1,200 from Gonzaga. 1,200. Do we see 1.3? 1.3 from DB City. Do we see 1.4? 1.4 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.5? Do we see 1.5? Going once at 1.4 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 1.5 from DB City. 1.6 from Nash FC. Do we see 1.7 from Gonzaga? Do we see 1.8? 1.8 from Nash. 1.9 from Gonzaga. 2,000 from Nash. 2.1 from Gonzaga. 2.2 from Nash. 2.2 from Nash. 2.3 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.3? 2.3 from Gonzaga. 2.4 from Nash. Do we see 2.5? 2.6. 2.6 from Nash. Going once at 2.6. Going once at 2,600 from Nash FC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 2,000. We see 2.7 from DB City. 2.8 from Nash. 2.9 from DB City. Do we see 3,000? 3,000 rupees from Nash. Going once at 3,000. Going once. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 3,000 to Nash FC.
One usher.
Gentlemen, kindly note that once the gavel is banged, you cannot raise the prices. It is final once the gavel is banged. Do not expect to be called upon after that. Thank you. The next player. The next player from the A category, player number 23, Mr. Shamil. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. 1,200 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids to the... Okay, we see 1,200 from Gonzaga FC. 1.2 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.3? Going once at 1.2 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. 1.3 from DB City. Do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,300 rupees to DB City. Player number 37. Player number 37 from the A category, Mr. Adil. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? 1,200. Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Next player, player number 12 from the A category, Mr. Safwan. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we? Okay, we see 1,200 from Nash FC. 1,200 from Nash FC. Do we see 1.3? Going once at 1.2 to Nash. 1.3 from DB City. 1.4 from Gonzaga. 1.5 from Nash. We see 1.6. 1.6 from FFC. Do we see 1.7 from Nash? 1.8 from Gonzaga. 1.9 from FFC. 2,000 from Nash. 2.1 from FFC. 2.1 from FFC. 2.2 from Nash. 2.3 from FFC. 2.4 from Nash. 2.5 from FFC. 2.6 from Nash. 2.7 from FFC. Going once. 2.8 from Gonzaga. 2.9 from FFC. 3,000 rupees from United Jaipur. Going once at 3,000 rupees. 3.1 from Gonzaga. 3.2 from FFC. Do we see 3.3? Do we see 3.3 from Gonzaga? Do we see 3.4 from United Jaipur? Do we see 3.5 FFC? We see 3.5 from Gonzaga. Do we see 3.6? 3.6 from United Jaipur. 3.7 from FFC. 3.8 from Gonzaga. 3.9 from United Jaipur. Do we see 4,000? 4,000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 4.1? Do we see 4.1? Going once at 4,000. 4.1 from United Jaipur. 4.2 from Gonzaga. 4.3 from United Jaipur. Going once at 4.3. 4.4 from Gonzaga. 4.5 from United Jaipur. Going once at 4.5. 4.6 from Gonzaga. 4.7 from United Jaipur. 4.8 from Gonzaga. Going once at 4.8. 4.9 from United Jaipur. 5,000 from Gonzaga. Going once at 5,000 rupees to Gonzaga FC. 5.1 from Jaipur. 5.2 from Gonzaga. Gonzaga is not going down easy. 5.3 and 5.4 from Gonzaga. 5.5 from United Jaipur. 5.6 from Gonzaga. 5.7, 5.8, 5.9, 6. 6,000 from Gonzaga. They are not going down without a fight. 6.1 from United Jaipur. 6.2 from Gonzaga. 6.3. Do we see 6.4 Gonzaga? Do we see 6.4 Gonzaga FC? Going once at 6.4 from Gonzaga FC. 6.5 from United Jaipur. 6.6 from Gonzaga FC. 6.7. Do we see 6.8? Do we see 6.8? Gonzaga FC. Do we see 6.8? Going once at 6,000. 6.8 from Gonzaga FC. 6.9 from United Jaipur. 7,000 Gonzaga FC. Do we see 7,000? Going once at 6,900 rupees to United. 7,000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 7.1? Going once at 7,000 rupees to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. We see 7.1 from United Jaipur. 7.2 from Gonzaga. 7.3 from United Jaipur. Going once at 7,300 to United Jaipur. Going once. Going twice. 7,400 from Gonzaga. 7,500 from United Jaipur. Do we see 7,600? Do we see 7,600? 7,600 from Gonzaga. Do we see 7,700? Going once at 7,600 to Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. 7,700. 7,800. Do we see 7.9? Going once at 7,700 to Gonzaga FC. 7.9 from Jaipur. Do we see 8,000? Do we see 8,000? Do we see 8,000? Okay, going once at 7,000. Okay, 8,000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 8,000? Going once at 8,000 rupees to Gonzaga. They were at 7,900. They bid 7,900. Going once at 8,000 rupees to Gonzaga FC. Going once. 8.1 from United Jaipur. 8.1. Gentlemen, there will not be made any time concession for discussion. It will be sold to the first bidder. 8.2. Do we see 8.2? Gonzaga FC. Do we see 8.2? 8.2 from Gonzaga FC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 8.2 to Gonzaga FC. Gentlemen, kindly note there will not be made any time concession. Please make your bids as quickly as possible, otherwise the player will be sold. The next player, player number 83, is a player from the A category, Mr. Unes. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? 1,200 from Gonzaga. 1,300 from FFC. Going once at 1,300. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,300 to FFC. Sold. I'm doing fast. Next player, player number 36. Mr. Rohan. Player number 36, Mr. Rohan. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see any bids? We see 1,200 from CA, 1,300 from Jaipur, 1,400 from DB City, 1,500 from CA, 1,600. Do we see 1.5? Going once at 1.5 to CA, going once, going twice. 1.6 from Jaipur, 1.7 from CA. Going once at 1.7, going 1.8 from Nash, 1.9 from Jaipur, 2,000 from CA, 2.1 from Nash, 2.2 from Jaipur, 2.3 from CA, 2.4 from Nash, 2.5 from CA. Going once at 2.5 to CA, going once, going twice. 2.6 from Jaipur, 2.7 from Mashal, 2.8 from CA, 2.9 from Gonzaga, 3,000 from CA. Going 3.1 from Jaipur, 3.2 from CA. Going once at 3.2, 3.3 from Jaipur, 3.4 from DB City, 3.5 from CA, 3.6 from Jaipur, 3.7 from CA, 3.8 from Jaipur, 3.9 from CA, 4,000 from Mashal FC, 4.1 from CA, 4.2 from Jaipur, 4.3 from CA, 4.4 from Jaipur, 4.5 from Mashal, 4.6 from CA, 4.7 from Jaipur, 4.8 from Gonzaga, 4.9 from Mashal, 5,000 from CA, 5.1 from Jaipur, 5.1 from Jaipur, 5.2. Do we see 5.2? 5.2 from CA. 5.3 from Jaipur. 5.4. Do we see 5.4? 5.4 from CA. 5.5 from Jaipur, 5.6 from Gonzaga, 5.7 from CA, 5.8 from Jaipur, 5.8 from Jaipur, 5.9. Do we see 5.9? Going once at 5.8, 5.9 from CA. 6,000 rupees from Jaipur. Do we see 6.1? 6.1 from CA. 6.2 from Jaipur. Do we see 6.3? 6.3 from CA. 6.4 from Jaipur. 6.5 from CA. 6.6 from Jaipur. 6.7. Do we see 6.7? CA. Do we see 6.7? 6.7 from CA. Going once at 6.7 to CA United. 6.8 from Jeppu. 6.9. Do we see 6.9 from CA? 7,000 rupees. Do we see 7,000 rupees? 7,000 from Jeppu. Do we see 7.1? 7.1 from CA. 7.2 from Jeppu. 7.2 from Jeppu. Do we see 7.3? 7.3. 7.3 from CA. 7.4 from Jeppu. Do we see 7.5? Do we see 7.5? 7.5 from CA. 7.6 from Jeppu. 7.7. Do we see 7.7? CA United. Do we see 7.7? 7.7 from CA. 7.8 from Jeppu. 7.9 from CA. 8,000 from Jeppu. Do we see 8.1? Do we see 8.1? Going once at 8.1 from CA. Going once at 8,100 rupees to CA United. Going once, going twice. 8,200 rupees from Jeppu. Do we see 8,300? 8,300 from CA. Going once at 8,300. Going once, going twice. 8,400 from Jeppu. 8,500 from CA. Do we see 8.6 from Jeppu? Do we see 8.7? Do we see 8.7? Going once at 8.6. Going once. Going twice. Going. $8.6 from Jeppu to 8.7 from CA. Going once at 8,700 to CA United. Going once, going twice. Sold at 8,700 rupees to CA United. Player number 49 from the B category is Mr. Sadaf. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? We see Gonzaga FC at 1,000 rupees. Going once at 1,000 rupees. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 to Gonzaga FC. 59. Player number 59. Mr. Sheikh Zaid. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids for 1,000 rupees? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 45. Mr. Mufiz from the B category. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Any bids? Any bids at 1,000? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. 58. Player number 58 from the B category is Mr. Juwez. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. We see a bid from Mashal FC at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1.1? Going once at 1,000 rupees from Mashal FC. 1. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 to Mashal FC. 6. Player number 60, Mr. Zakir from the B category. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. 60. Player number 60, Mr. Zakir. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids at 1,000? Seeing no bids, going once at 1,000 rupees, going twice at 1,000 rupees, player remains unsold. Player number 55. Player number 55, Mr. Sahil. Okay. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. From the B category, Mr. Sahil, player number 55, bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000? Do we see 1,000? we see 1000? We don't see 1000. Going once, going twice. Player remains unsold. 66. Player number 66 from the B category, Mr. Zain. Mr. Zain. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player, player number 13 from the B category, Mr. Monish. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Player number 13. Do we see any bids? Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player, player number 10, Mr. Atul Madhu. Player number 10, Mr. Atul Madhu. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we see any bids? We see Gonzaga FC with 1000 rupees. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1000 to Gonzaga FC. Player number 25. Player number 25, Mr. Ajit from the B category. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? Going once. Going twice. We see 1000 rupees from DB City. 1000 rupees from DB City going once. Going twice. Sold at 1000 to DB City. Player number 95, Mr. Rizwan Ahmed. Player number 95, Mr. Rizwan Ahmed. And the B category, bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Do we see any bids? For 1000. Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player, player number 3 from the B category, Mr. Afnan. Mr. Afnan, player number 3, bidding begins at 1000 rupees. 1000 rupees. 1000 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.1? 1000 from Gonzaga, going once, going twice. Sold at 1000 to Gonzaga. The next player, player number 69, Lester from the B category. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees, going once. Do we see 1000? Do we see 1000? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player, player number 44. Player number 44, Mr. Muzambil from the B category. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we see 1000? Seeing no bids, going once. Okay, we see 1.1, 1.2 and 1.3 from FFC. 1.4 from Jeppu. 1.5 from FFC, 1.6 from DB City, 1.7 from Nash, 1.8 from Jeppu, 1.9 from Nash. FFC, do we see 2000? Do we see 2000? Jeppu, do we see 2000? 1.9. Do we see 2000? DB City, we see 2000 from DB City. 2.1, 2.2 from Nash.
Nizam.
2.2 from Nash. Going once at 2.2. 2.3 from Jeppu. 2.4 from Nash. 2.5 from Jeppu. 2.6 from Nash. 2.7 from Jeppu. Going once at 2.7. Going once. Going twice. 2.8 from DB City. Going once at 2,800 rupees to DB City. Going once. Going twice. 2,900 from Jeppu. Going once at 2,900. Going twice. Sold at 2,900 to Jeppu. Player number 54. Mr. Aksham. From the B category, bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Aksham, you buy him, bro. You buy him. Do we see 1,000? Do we see 1,000? Seeing no bids, going once, going twice. Player remains unsold. No one wants it. It's you. Next player, player number 14 from the B category, Mr. Ikshad. Bidding begins at 1,000. Bidding begins at 1,200. Mashal FC at 1,200. Do we see 1.3? Do we see 1.3? Okay, going once at 1,200 to Mashal FC, going once. 1.3 from DB City. Do we see 1.4? Going once at 1.3 to DB City, going once, going twice. Sold at 1.3 to DB City. Player number 75, Mr. Munahin from the B category. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,200 rupees. Do we see 1,200? 1,200 from Nash FC. 1,300 from CA, 1,400 from FFC, 1,500 from Nash, 1,006, 1,007, 1.8, 1.9. Do we see 2? 2 from CA, 3 from Nash, 2.1, sorry, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.4 from Nash, 2.5 from FFC, 2.6 from CA, 2.7 from Nash, 2.8 from FFC, 2.8 from FFC, 2.9 from DB City, 3,000 from FFC, going once at 3,000, 3.1 from CA, 3.2 from FFC, 3.3 from CA, 3.4 from FFC, going once at 3.5 to CA, 3.6 to FFC, going 3.7 to CA, 3.8 to FFC, going once at 3.7 to FFC, 3.8 to CA, 3.9 to FFC, 4,000 to CA, 4.1 to FFC, going once at 4.1, going once, 4.2 to CA, 4.3 to FFC, going once at 4.3, going once, going twice, 4.4 to CA, 4.5 to FFC, going once at 4.5, going once, going twice, 4.6 from CA, 4.7 from FFC, 4.8 from CA, 4.9 from FFC, 5,000. Do we see 5,000? Going once at 4.9 to FFC, going once, going twice, 5,000 from CA, 5.1 from FFC. Do we see 5.2? Going once at 5,100 rupees to FFC, going once, going twice, sold at 5,100 rupees to CA. Sold at 5,100 rupees to FFC. 5,100. 5.1. The next player, player number 78, Mr. Gautam. From the B category, bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see 1,000? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. 63, player number 63, Mr. Seth. From the B category, bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids at 1,000 rupees? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 94, Mr. Arul. begins at 1000 rupees from the B category. Mr. Arul, do we have 1000? 1000 from Gonzaga. 1000 from Gonzaga going once. We see 1.1 from DB. 1.2 from Gonzaga. Going once at 1.2. Going once, going twice. 1.3 from DB. 1.4 from Gonzaga. Going once at 1.4. Going once, going twice. 1.5 to DB City. 1.6 to Gonzaga. 1.7 from DB City. Do we see 1.8? 1.8. Do we see 1.9? Going once at 1.8. Going once, going twice. Sold at 1.8 to Gonzaga. Player number 67, Mr. Ayan from the B category. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we see any bids, gentlemen? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 64, Mr. Amog Shetty. We have Mr. Amog Shetty from the B category. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Do we have any bidders? Seeing no bidders. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 92, Mr. Arya. Do we see any bids for Mr. Arya beginning at 1000 rupees? Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player, player number 40 from the B category, Mr. Akhilesh. Going once at 1000 rupees. Do we see any bids at 1000 rupees for Mr. Akhilesh? Player number 40. Going once. Going twice. Okay, we see 1000, 1.1 from Gonzaga. Do we see 1.2? 1.2 from CA. Going once at 1.2 to CA. 1.3 from Gonzaga. 1.4 from CA. 1.5 from Gonzaga. 1.6 from CA. 1.7 from Gonzaga. Going once at 1.7. Going once, going twice. 1.8 from CA. 1.9 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2000? CA, do we see 2000? We see 2000 from DB City. 2.1 from Gonzaga. Do we see 2.2? Do we see 2.2? Do we see 2.2 from Gonzaga? Do we see 2.3? Do we see 2.3? Going once at 2.2 to Gonzaga. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 2,200 rupees to Gonzaga FC. Player number 56 from the B category, Mr. Mashroof. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we have any bidders? Seeing no bidders. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 16, Mr. Muaz. Do we see any bidders for 1,000 rupees? Going once at 1,000. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 28. Player number 28, Mr. Shubham. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bidders? 1,000 rupees for Mr. Shubham. Do we see any bidders? Going once at 1,000. Going once at 1,000. 1.1. Do we see any 1,000? 1.1. Do we see anything? Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 31, Mr. Sohan. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees, and do we see any bidders? Going once at 1,000 rupees. Seeing no bidders. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 25, Mr. Ajit. Player number 25. Player number 93. Player number 93, Mr. Pranav. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going once at 1,000. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. 51. Player number 51, Mr. Rahib. Do we see any bids at 1,000 rupees? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 16. We just did this. Is this 16? Fine. Player number 91, Mr. Nakir. Player number 91. Do we see any bids at 1,000? Seeing no bids. Going once. 1,000 from DB City. 1.1. Do we see 1.1? Seeing no further bids, we go 1,000 from DB City once, twice. Sold at 1,000 to DB City. Player number 99. Player number 99, Mr. Amir. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees from the B category. Mr. Amir, do we see any bids? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 100, Mr. Hisham. Player number 100, Mr. Hisham. Do we see any bids at 1,000? Seeing no bids at 1,000. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 26, Mr. Joel Lobo. Player number 26, Mr. Joel Lobo. Do we see any bids at 1,000? We see 1,000 from Mashal FC. Going once at 1,000 to Mashal FC. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 to Mashal FC. Player number 18, Mr. Tehsir. Player number 18, Mr. Tehsir. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Player number 81, Mr. Rikaz. Player number 81, Mr. Rikaz. Bidding begins at 1,000 rupees. Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 57. Player number 57, Mr. Nihal. Bidding begins at 1,000. Do we see any bidders at 1,000? Seeing no bidders. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 27. Player number 27, Mr. Kef. Going once at 1,000 rupees. Do we see any bidders at 1,000 rupees? Seeing no bidders. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 87. Player number 87. Zahim. Mr. Zahim. Do we see any bids at 1,000? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 42, Mr. Masood. Player number 42, Mr. Masood. Bidding begins at 1,000. Seeing no bidders. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 70, Mr. Salman. Player number 70, Mr. Salman. 7070, Mr. Salman. Bidding begins at 1000. Do we see 1000? Seeing no bids. Going once. Going twice. Nash FC at 1000. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1000 to Nash. Player number 82. Player number 82 to Mahiz. Player number 82, Mahiz. Bidding begins at 1000. Do we see 1000? 1000 from Jeppu. Going once at 1000. Going twice at 1000. Sold at 1000 to Jeppu. Player number 29. Player number 29. Player number 29, Jordan. Do we see any bidders for Mr. Jordan? Going once at 1000. Going once. Going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 21. Player number 21, Mr. Zamil. A category. Bidding begins at 1200 from FFCBC 1200. Going once at 1200. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1200 to FFC. Player number 7, Mr. Paktilal. Player number 7, Mr. Paktilal. 1000 rupees from Jeppu. Going once at 1000. We see 1.1 from Mashal. 1.2 from Jeppu. 1.3 from Mashal. 1.4 from Jeppu. 1.5 from Mashal. 1.6 from Jeppu. 1.6 going once. Going twice. 1.7 from Mashal. 1.8 from Jeppu. 1.9 from DB City. 2000 from Mashal. 2.1, 2.2. 2.3, 2.4. 2.5, 2.6. 2.7 to Mashal. 2.8 to Jeppu. 2.9 to DB City. 3000 to Mashal. 3.1 to Jeppu. 3.2 to DB. 3.3 to Mashal. 3.4 to Jeppu. 3.5 to Mashal. 3.6 to Jeppu. 3.7 to Mashal. 3.8 to Jeppu. Going once at 3.8. 3.9 to Mashal. 4000 to Jeppu. 4.1 to Mashal. 4.2 to Jeppu. 4.3 to Mashal. 4.4 to Jeppu. Going once at 4.4. 4.5 to Mashal. 4.6 to Jeppu. 4.7 to Mashal. 4.8 to Jeppu. 4.9, 5000, 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, 5.4, 5.4 to Jeppu. Going 5.5 to Mashal. 5.6 to Jeppu. 5.7, 5.8, 5.9, 6000, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, 6.7, 6.8, 6.9, 7000, 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, 7.5, 7.5, 7.6, 7.7, 7.7, 7.8, 7.9, 8000. Okay, fine. 8.1, Jeppu, 8.1, 8000. Okay, sold at 8000 rupees to Jeppu. Player number 65, Mr. Pratham. Player number 65, Mr. Pratham. Bidding begins at 1000. Seeing no bidders, going once, going twice. Player remains unsold. The next player, we have player number 71.
Hold on, hold on.
Mr.
Pause.
Okay. Wake up, man. Bye. Oh my god, I've literally not eaten anything. Y'all are such haters. Fine, bye. Player number 71, bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Mr. Muhad from the B category. Seeing no bidders, going once, going twice, player remains unsold. Player number 86, Mr. Ruiz. Player number 86, Mr. Ruiz. Bidding begins at 1000 rupees. Going once, going twice. Seeing no bidders, player remains unsold. Player number 76, Mr. Sanjeet. Player number 76. Bidding begins at 1000. Going once, going twice. Player remains unsold. Player number 86, Mr. Ruiz. Sorry. Okay, player number 98 then, I guess. Mr. Afraz, player number 98. Player number 52. Player number 52, Mr. Afreed. Going once, going twice, unsold. Player number 8, Mr. Razik. Player number 8, bidding begins at 1000. Going once, going twice, player remains unsold. Player number 79, Mr. Akib. Player number 79, Mr. Akib. Bidding begins at 1000. Do we see any bidders? Do we see any bidders? Going once, going twice, player remains unsold. I'll cry. Player number 85, Mr. Adil. Player number 45, Mr. Mufiz. Bidding begins at 1000. Seeing no bidders, going once, going twice, player remains unsold. Next number. Player number 56. Player number 56, Mr. Mashroof. 1000 rupees. Unsold. It did. Player number 8, Mr. Razik. Player number 8, going at 1000 rupees. Mashal FC at 1000. 1.1 from CA. 1.2 from Mashal. Going once at 1.2, going once. 1.3 from CA. 1.4 from Mashal. Going once at 1.4. Going once, going twice. Sold at 1.4 to Mashal FC. Sold, man. CA United requires 3 more players. United Jaipur requires 1 more player. Saif number 63, player number 63, Mr. Saif. Going once at 1,000 rupees. We see any bids at 1,000. We see Jeppo at 1,000. Going once to Jeppo. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1,000 to Jeppo. Over Jeppo done. Only CA left. What is GB doing? How many there? Player number 57. Mr. Nihal. CA at 1,000. Going once to CA. 1.1 from DB. 1.2 from CA. 1.3 from DB. 1.4 from CA. Going once at 1.4. Going once. Going twice. Sold at 1.4 to CA. That concludes our auction for today. That concludes our auction for today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being present this evening. I am Gabriel Vegas and I am signing out.